I'm Donna De Salvo, Deputy Director for International Initiatives and Senior Curator at the Whitney Museum of American Art and the curator of Andy Warhol From A to B and Back Again, opening at the Whitney this November 2018. I've been fortunate to have an extraordinary team working with me on this exhibition. Christy Mitchell and Mark Loacano, who've been a real lead on this, along with Lauren Young. Claire Henry, assistant curator on the Warhol Film Project, has organized a compendium of films that tease out certain themes in the exhibition. The films will be shown in our Hess Family Theater in their original 16mm format. Andy Warhol From A to B and Back Again surveys over 40 years of the career of one of the most extraordinary and well-known artists in the United States and globally. This will be the first exhibition organized by an American institution in more than almost 30 years. The Whitney has an incredible history with Warhol that dates back to one of his first retrospectives that came to New York in 1971. The exhibition ranges work from the late 1940s, when Warhol was still a student at the Carnegie Institute of Technology, through his pivotal years as a commercial artist working in New York City, to his major pop period of the 1960s, and to the still less well-known but extraordinarily experimental 70s and 80s, as Warhol brought together many of the techniques that he had been evolving over the course of a lifetime to experiment with his notion of abstraction through the ready-made photograph. As an artist, the thing that most fascinated me about Warhol is the way he would connect his art to the world. If you really think about Warhol and the way he circulated images into the culture, Warhol really understood the power of the image, both within advertising, within art, and he melded the two. Warhol is an artist who one can see really anticipated a digital landscape. Warhol arrived in New York City in 1949, fresh from the Carnegie Institute, and he needed to find a job. His first job in New York was illustrating shoes for Glamour magazine for an article with the prophetic title, What is Success? And one of the chapters within this multi-page article was called Success is a Job in New York. Warhol learned very quickly about how to impart an image, to have it sell, to have it look fashionable. And also, of course, the most critical thing is that it only mattered what Warhol's works looked like in reproduction. Because Warhol was so identified with shoes, he actually began to make shoe collages, and these were called his personality shoes and boots. Warhol would anthropomorphize the shoe, and amongst this series, there's an Elvis Presley boot, there's a Mae West shoe, there's a Diana Vreeland shoe, all of these figures that were part of the fashion industry, but also would be part of gay culture. Here, Warhol does a very high embellishment of the shoes. They're very pointy, very stylish, but also slightly Victorian in a way. Beginning in 1960, Warhol began to make paintings with very direct references to advertisements, things that he found not in the pages of Vogue or Glamour, but were more likely located in the National Enquirer and in the back pages. Before and After 4 is a very key work because it is an advertisement for nose surgery, for rhinoplasty. Warhol was unhappy with his own nose, so there's certainly a biographical read here. But what's especially interesting here is how this before and after is key in terms of looking at Warhol's painting process. So there's an earlier version of this where the drips and the brush marks of abstract expression are still evident. And Warhol even said, can you really make a painting without drips and brush marks and still have it be considered a painting? So he, along with other artists, Lichtenstein, Rosenquist, they're still grappling with the vestiges of abstract expressionism. Warhol then made several paintings of the same subject, which got tighter and tighter. And this one looks almost identical to the advertisement on which it's based. Green Coca-Colas, which of course is a breakthrough because it is made with the silkscreen, is where Warhol takes forward this idea of a product that has a democratic quality to it. There's a quote in his 1975 Philosophy of Andy Warhol, From A to B and Back Again, from which this exhibition gets its title, where he talks about the fact that no one could get a Coke that would be better than anyone else's Coke. Even the Queen of England and the bum on the street corner always drank the same Coke. Warhol picked up on the democratic aspects, but also that Coca-Cola was one of the most highly marketed brands and still is to this day. But what is most important is that once Warhol marries the photographic image and the silkscreen and uses it as one would use a brush, he never looks back, and it is the device that he uses throughout his career. Marilyn Diptych 1962 is one of Warhol's masterpieces, and this is the case for a variety of reasons. First, it shows something about Warhol's awareness of topicality. He had been working previously on a series of paintings about Elizabeth Taylor, and then he said, but then Marilyn died, and so he had to do Marilyn. Now, Monroe here, you could argue, functions on a variety of levels. You could see her as a drag queen. She was a heartthrob, the blonde bombshell. She was also a highly constructed image. She's really a product of the star system and the studio system. And so Warhol could understand that notion of constructing an image. And even the way Warhol begins to let the image deteriorate, which is purely done by the pressure of the squeegee pressing the ink through the screen, or because the screen became clogged and Warhol just allowed that to be the case. So for everyone who always sees Warhol as someone who makes these identical images, really close scrutiny of these works tells quite the opposite story. Often people think that after the 60s, Warhol did not make any great work of consequence. In fact, one of the arguments of this exhibition is to see the continuing exploration of Warhol's work in painting and various other media. He was asked to make paintings of the most famous person in the world. The famous person that was suggested to Warhol was Albert Einstein. Warhol rejected this idea. At the time, in 1972, President Nixon had made his historic visit to China. This was the first time ever that an American president had gone to the People's Republic. This was well covered in the press, and Warhol decided that Mao was the most famous person in the world. This particular Mao, which measures over 14 feet, suggests something about the way the Mao image lives in Tiananmen Square. Warhol used as his source an image of Mao that appeared in the Little Red Book. And what's very different here is seeing, particularly in the lower left corner of the canvas, the paint treatment that had gone on. Warhol actually painted this by hand. As always, the background would be hand-painted, and then the silkscreen, the black image, is what articulated the features. But you can see actually his fingers here. In 1975, Warhol was given a commission to do a series of what, at that time, the collector called drag queens. He and Bob Colacello decided that they would find their models within the transgender community. The colorful quality of them and the performative quality of them also speaks not only to Warhol's approach, but to the individuals themselves and the role that they were playing and how they expressed themselves. Andy Warhol is amongst one of the most well-known artists in the world. In part, Warhol engineered this. He understood how to market. He understood the notion of branding, perhaps not the idea of branding we have today, but he certainly understood how to construct a persona. The 1964 self-portrait, which was made using a photo booth that Warhol went into and took his photograph, shows a cool Warhol, an emboldened Warhol looking straight into the camera with his classic T-shirt on. The image above is a self-portrait in drag, and it's really not the Warhol one gets to see. Yes, he wore the silver wig, but the idea of seeing Warhol in drag, and these are a series of self-portraits that are done with Warhol in various poses, also speaks to a Warhol that maybe could not be out in public. So this idea of the persona of Warhol and that someone who was as calculated in constructing an image of himself, really selling himself and branding himself in the way that one might a product, creating mystery around himself. In 1970, he decided to standardize his portrait format. Portraiture, of course, is a genre that Warhol pursues throughout his career. The 40 by 40 format is one that he arrived at with an idea that perhaps someday he would assemble these into a portrait of society. There are hundreds of these portraits. Debbie Harry, done in 1980, of course, the great Blondie, that also appeared in some of Warhol's TV programs. Warhol would have the individual come to the factory and he would arrange how they should look. Most often he put powder on them to erase the wrinkles. He really made everyone look their best. And then he often had the similar treatment in terms of the application of lipstick onto the women or eyeshadow. But these are amongst hundreds of images that Warhol made of singers, of movie stars, of political figures. And it really became his mainstay that supported his work and that of the factory throughout the 70s and the 80s, because Warhol was not selling a lot of his work during this time. Warhol makes a series of paintings that take an abstract motif, but it's abstraction interpreted through something that exists, and that is the concept of the Rorschach. Now, these works really harken back to an early technique, which is Warhol's blotted line. It's a technique that he uses throughout the 1950s. He would draw on one piece of paper and then take another piece of paper, blot it, and get a very characteristic, uneven, broken line. And it actually was really something that helped him in terms of his career as a commercial artist. So in this one work, we have both a reference back to Warhol's years as a commercial artist, but also in view of his experience with abstraction, really crystallizing the whole idea of meaning and the way in which works of art are really constructions and that meaning is interpreted by the viewer. The viewer projects onto the painting what they see in it. And it is exactly that notion of interpretation which is key to the Rorschach when it's used in psychological testing. It's almost hard to imagine that by the 1980s, Warhol was not an artist who was being talked about in the art world. Of course, he was everywhere. Someone once said Warhol would go to the opening of an envelope. He was a fixture in New York City. But in the early 80s, he meets a number of younger artists, including Jean-Michel Basquiat and Keith Haring, and he's very excited by what they are doing. The energy of artists such as Haring, who were working in the subways, or the graffiti artists who were tagging subway cars, is something that Warhol finds particularly attractive, not to mention the energy of their youth. Paramount is a painting that brings together many, many interesting motifs, some of which belong to Basquiat and some of which are Warhol's.